Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another Bible study and episode review in Shady Oak Ministries. I'm, of course, Shady Oak, and today we're going to be discussing episode 13 of season 8 of the TV show My Little Pony: Friendship is Magic, the episode The Mean Six. Now, for those of you who are familiar with what these studies are and what we're trying to do here, no need to explain, but for those of us just joining us, our goal here isn't to make the accusation that the writers of My Little Pony are intentionally putting forward a Christian message, but as a Christian myself and having that form of worldview, my goal is to share with you our perspective on how we view Scripture and how it applies to our lives. And in any effort of effective communication, you want to speak the same language as the person you're talking to. So whether you find yourself as a Christian who's curious as to what My Little Pony has to do with the Bible, or you're not a Christian but know My Little Pony, this is what this ultimately is to be for, is to communicate these Christian themes with common language and give us one more reason to be able to enjoy this show. As far as today's episode is concerned, I'd like you to turn to the Gospel according to John chapter 8 and verse 42, where we're going to be discussing contrasts, comparing one thing to another, the lesser to the greater, and ultimately and hopefully be able to properly define a relationship with God, the terms of which we can have a relationship with God, and also what the alternative looks like. Because there's nothing more misrepresented in this culture. Well, actually, there's two things that haven't been more misrepresented in this culture than A, God's intentions for you, and B, Satan's true nature. We treat him as the equal and opposite of God. I hope today to debunk that. John 8:42 says, Jesus said to them, "If God were your Father, you would love me, for I proceeded forth and came from God. Nor have I come of myself, but he sent me. Why do you not understand my speech? Because you are not able to listen to my word. You are of your father, the devil, and the desires of your father you want to do. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own resources, for he is a liar and the father of it." Now, two things I need to point out for those of you who don't understand how these first century authors were trying to communicate their message. And no shame in that, mind you. But when we're talking about someone being referred to as a father, Jesus isn't saying that Satan secretly impregnated all of these guys as mothers and that it turns out that they're all half demon. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying is they are all reflecting the character of good old dad. Their ultimate spiritual example, their father, isn't God. Otherwise, they'd recognize him when he was talking to them, because he was. Jesus was God incarnate. But on the other hand, they couldn't understand what Jesus was saying because their father had nothing to do with Jesus. Now, this is what we're going to be talking about today. There's a mistake that's often made in assuming, assuming that God and Satan are equals as well as opposites. That just like Satan is the exact opposite of God, the assumption then is made, well, Satan's like the evil God, and God is the good God. You got the light side and the dark side of the force, so to speak, constantly battling it out. And the reason why one exists and the other hasn't been destroyed is because they're in this stalemate. That is not the case. In fact, that's not even close to the case. Satan is a created being. He's an angel of great power, but an angel nonetheless. And when we're talking about this statement of God and Satan being opposites, we need to define our terms. What are they opposites in? In power? Wouldn't that mean that Satan is powerless and God is all-powerful? That's not what we mean. Satan has power, but catch where the power came from. Where is their opposite then? They are opposites in character. If you were to describe the kind of person that God was, if you were to take a personality profile test on Facebook or whatever, then the exact opposite result, if they were accurate, would reflect in Satan. And when we're comparing the two, we're talking about the kind of person you are interacting with, the kind of relationship you'd be having. Now, to point this all out in terms that we all, as people who've hopefully seen today's episode of My Little Pony, can understand, I'm going to use 3 C's to ultimately compare and contrast Satan and God. as far as their character is concerned, using Chrysalis and the mean six, as well as the main six and what was originally intended. The first example, the first C in our comparison, will be creation. God creates. Satan only perverts what God has made. Like Chrysalis, who needed a strand of hair from each of the main six and needed to copy their images in order to create these perverse, season 2 discorded clones of the main six. She couldn't create anything of herself. She required something that was already good and twisted it. This is exactly how Satan functions. He's never created anything on his own. Evil is not an entity in and of itself. Evil is good twisted. And that's really what Satan is. When we call someone a pervert, it's usually implying just one category. But in all terms, it's referring to something being twisted for a purpose of which it was never intended to be. So when we saw the mean six, what were they? They were the main six perverted. Instead of generous, they were greedy. Instead of honest, they were liars. And you get the point. So when we're talking about God and Satan being compared and contrast, understand Satan's never created anything. All he can do is take something good and twist it. Thus, the concept of evil is founded in Satan's character. Because he's God's nature, hopefully and not hopefully, he was intended to reflect that, to be good. But on the other hand, respecting his free will, he decided to go his own direction and twisted the nature of God he was intended to reflect and instead distorted it. Does that make sense? Let me know in the comments because I can't hear you. So that's the first C, is in creation. When we're talking about God and Satan, their capacity to create couldn't be more unalike. God makes things and by them defines good. Satan takes what God has made as good and twists it for a purpose it was never intended to be. That's evil. The second C in our comparison is going to be conviction. Conviction means to be made aware of guilt. And both God and Satan do this, but just like with creation, in exactly opposite ways. Because understand this, when God makes us aware of what we've done wrong, he comforts. When Satan makes us aware of what we've done wrong, he condemns. Now, why are those opposites? Well, like with the mean six and their little switcheroo dust-up between the main six and the conflict that they created in their relationships with each other, when our relationship with God is damaged in any way, when we sin, notice I didn't say if, when we sin, when we do something imperfect in our actions or our attitudes, the voice that usually comes up first in our heads is the one that points out what we have done wrong and then stops there. That's called condemnation, where it focuses on what has been done wrong. And when something has been pointed out that we have done wrong, yeah, that's plainly obvious, but what then? Do you just keep fighting about it? Do you keep sulking about it? Or do you stay miserable about it? Or do you do what God does? Do what the main six did? And what was that? They acknowledged, firstly, just like with Satan, catch this, what they had done was wrong. And then sought restoration. Then acknowledged what they had done was wrong, apologized, and sought a restored relationship. Because catch this, conviction is to be made aware of guilt, as it was defined. But when God acknowledges that what we have done is wrong, he's not going to ignore that. He then says, here's how we fix it. When Satan acknowledges what we have done is wrong, and he would know, he's oftentimes the one that led us into it, right? That made us aware of it, that stoked our desire to pursue it. He then turns around and says, I can't believe what you did. You call yourself a Christian, you call yourself a good person, and you did that. Well, what did we see with the mean six? They caused damage to the relationship, and it stayed there. But what then did the main six do? They didn't even consider the fact that there was some outside influence impacting their lives. All they cared about was two things. Notice two. That harm had been done. It didn't matter from whom, what, or why. All that mattered was then what they did about it, that they sought forgiveness from each other. They asked for it. And what do you think? It was refused? And if you think if 6 Technicolor horses could figure that out, the creator of the universe, who is the example, the origin of that concept, won't also forgive you if you ask? 1 John 1:9, somebody? So catch that. The voice that acknowledges harm to pursue healing rather than to rub in the harm done is the difference between God and Satan as far as conviction is concerned, because they both do that, but one's in a perversion. One stops short of completing the restoration. That's the difference. And the thirdly and finally, conformation, to be transformed into the image of something else. God died for his world. Satan wants to kill it. Plainly contrasted, just like we saw in John chapter 8, right? We've got the image of the one who, instead of giving life, wants to take it, the murderer, right? Just like we have the source and definition of truth itself, the voice of God, the one whose words literally established and reflect reality. We have a liar and the father of lies itself. Why? Because he wants nothing to do with the voice of God or the actions of God. He wants to see it all destroyed, reflecting a certain other little bug, don't you think? Now catch this. Like the tree of harmony, who set everything right. When God deals with Satan, it will be over before it even starts. If you don't believe me, read Revelation chapter 20. But understand, Revelation 20 is not going to happen until sometime in the future. And that's the whole point. The only reason Satan is even a thing right now is because God is allowing, pay attention to this, a second option to be available. When we say no to God, he respects it. He isn't looking for, like Chrysalis, servants. He wants children. He created us for a relationship with him. And when we understand that a relationship requires, by definition, the opportunity to say no to it, the relationship that we are then being offered with God allows and demands a second option to be available. And isn't it interesting how when we compare the character of Satan and the character of God, two who couldn't in their character be more unlike each other, we then can make an informed decision as to which is the better option. Now catch this. You can choose Satan. God will respect that. He doesn't exempt you from the consequences of said action, but he respects your choice, your ability to make that choice. So when we see why is evil still being allowed to happen in this world, so we're seeing what it's like to be separate from God. Until we have our relationship with God restored in the physical, this world is only going to get worse and worse. Why? Because it's separated from the source of everything good. It's not why do bad things happen to good people, it's why do good things happen at all. In the state that we're in right now, under the voluntary authority of Satan, the only reason God hasn't snuffed everything that Satan's got his meaty little claws on is because you and me still have to make a choice. He isn't going to force you into heaven. Because what makes heaven heaven? What is heaven? It's where God is. And if you don't want that, he has made accommodations for you. He'll respect that decision. But let me tell you this. It's not an existence you want. He is not the kind of relationship. He is not the kind of being you want to reflect the character of forever. And in seeing both reflected and presented firsthand, the main six or the mean six, who would you rather be? John chapter 10 and verse 10. The thief does not come except to steal and to kill and to destroy. Jesus speaking said, I have come that they may have life and may have it more abundantly. And with those two reasons, to not only give us our lives back, but also lives worth living again, as opposed to someone who just wants to snuff it out and will do it with enough finesse to make us comfortable along the way. I think the case has been made. You are now free to make your decision. And all that is required to choose Jesus is to simply acknowledge who he is and what he's done for you. And what is that? Well, firstly, who is he? He is God, come to this earth to show you what that heart ultimately looks like, who you'll be spending heaven with forever. And what did he do that made that relationship possible? If we have sinned, if we have damaged our relationship with God, we have caused harm, whether by the fault of some doppelganger, right, or our own choices. He paid the penalty that separation from the source of life naturally grants, and that is death. And that is all of our problems. If it ultimately sums it all up, it's coming down to that. We are going to die. But Jesus, God himself, came to this earth, took on everything death had to offer, and now through him proved that through his resurrection from the dead, that anyone who believes in him, even if they die, they will live. And because he's the only one in history to have a verifiable resurrection from the dead by his own power, I'm willing to take his word at that. If any of you are interested in that kind of relationship, all you have to do is acknowledge who he is and what he's done, and I can now welcome you as a sibling and a saint. Thank you for your time in listening to this study. If you have any sincere questions, there's plenty more that could be discussed on this topic, but I want to put that into your hands. Leave them in the comments below. Sincerity will always be matched with clarity. If you'd like to encourage the ministry, you know where to go. But most importantly, if you know someone who perhaps has fallen into that trap and thinking that Satan and Jesus are just equal in power, and we're hoping for the day that Jesus gets that one up on him, please put that to rest and share this video with anyone you feel would be blessed by it. Or even better, just take what is in this video and share it with them yourself. Thank you for your time and listen to the study. Remember that Jesus loves you and that Satan hates you. And you have the choice as to who you ultimately will want to spend forever reflecting the heart of and enjoying.